Welcome to Northeastern University's NU Cast series. Today we will discuss obesity. Our moderator for this afternoon's discussion, Richard A. Daynard, is professor of law at the Northeastern University School of Law, where he has been teaching since 1969. He holds a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School, a master's in sociology from Columbia University, and a PhD from MIT in urban studies and planning, specializing in law and social policy. Professor Daynard has been involved in a number of organizations devoted to combating this epidemic caused by tobacco and, more recently, obesity. These include serving as the president of the Public Health Advocacy Institute, chair of the Tobacco Products Liability Project, and chair of the Law and Obesity Project. He has published more than 80 articles, appeared in or been interviewed by major international media programs, and spoken on these issues in more than 35 countries. Jessica Hoffman is associate professor in the Department of Counseling and Applied Educational Psychology in the Bouvet College of Health Sciences at Northeastern. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Hamilton College, her master's of education in human development, and her PhD in school psychology from Lehigh University. She completed her pre-doctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship in clinical psychology at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Her research focuses on school and home-based interventions to promote healthy eating in children. She's the author of more than 30 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters and is the principal investigator on an NIH-funded research grant to promote healthy eating among school-aged children. She is a co-principal investigator of Healthy Kids, Healthy Futures, a pilot project between Northeastern, Children's Hospital Boston, and the Boston Red Sox Foundation to promote healthy eating and physical activity among Head Start children and their families in the Fenway, Mission Hill, the South End, and Lower Roxbury. Dr. Hoffman is a licensed psychologist, a licensed school psychologist, and a nationally certified school psychologist. In 2007, she received the Leitner-Whitmer Award for the American Psychological Association for Early Career Scholarship. Alex Makriyannis is professor and Behrakis trustee chair in pharmaceutical biotechnology and director of the Center for Drug Discovery at Northeastern. He received his bachelor's degree in pharmaceutical chemistry at the University of Cairo, his PhD in medicinal chemistry at the University of Kansas, and completed postdoctoral training in synthetic organic chemistry at the University of California, Berkeley. In 2005, he established Northeastern's Center for Drug Discovery, which has since expanded to 57 members. The center is dedicated to discovering novel medications that address important medical needs, developing approaches and technologies that improve the success of finding new drugs, and training and educating scientists in the art of drug discovery and development. In 2002, Professor Makriyannis won the American Association of Pharmaceutical Scientists Research Achievement Award in Drug Design and Discovery and has published more than 300 articles in scientific journals. I will now turn this over to Professor Daynard.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here for this discussion of this really important topic. I think we probably all have our favorite chilling statistics about the obesity epidemic. The basics are that compared to about 30 years ago, we have doubled the number of people who are obese in the United States. I think we've had a doubling of the obesity rate and the overweight rate. We're now at a point where we have over 30% of the American adults obese and an additional 30% who are overweight but not quite obese at this point. And some of the people who are obese, there's a whole spectrum of obesity, and the spectrum has been moving in the direction of the most severe, of morbidly obese. In the case of children, while the numbers are somewhat lower, we have a tripling of the proportion of children who are overweight or obese compared with 25 or so years ago. The effects, and I think my colleagues here will talk about them in more detail, but let me begin with my, as I say, favorite bone-chilling statistic, which is from a Centers for Disease Control study of several years ago, which said that of the children born in the United States in the year 2000, if nothing was done to upset the trend, and I can assure you nothing has been done to upset the trend, that over one-third of those children will develop diabetes. We're talking about a disease that normally, before this epidemic, had a incidence rate of something like 5% of the population. So we're going to be well over 30% of the population, higher for blacks, even higher for Hispanics. So we're talking about what's, perhaps the ultimate chronic disease. It's a disease that causes all kinds of complications in the course of a lifetime. And it's also, in a strange way, what I see as the silver lining to the question as to whether anything's going to be done about this epidemic, which is what we'll be spending most of our time on. And it's my assurance that something will be done, because the other two-thirds of the population are simply not going to be able to make enough money to pay for the healthcare costs of the third that's diabetic. This doesn't work, and at some point, therefore, the U.S. will get serious about doing something about this problem. But I'm afraid that point will not be before there are literally millions, if not tens of millions, of premature deaths as a result of this epidemic. So that's my favorite statistic. Jessica, do you have one, or do you have a take on this?
Well, I think that when it comes to really simplifying this problem, it really comes down to energy balance. And I know, Alex, you're going to be talking a lot about the biological underpinnings of the problem in a little bit. But very simply stated, it's really a matter of taking in more calories than we expend over a protracted period of time. And the way our environment is currently set up, we've really created an ideal set of circumstances to make this happen. So it's not really surprising that we're facing this problem if we think about some of the environmental factors that surround us in our everyday lives. And I think one of the take-home messages from this panel today is there's not going to be a simple answer for what is the primary factor, the primary cause for the obesity problem, and there's not going to be a simple solution. That we need to think about the very complex nature of this problem. So when we think about this energy in, energy out balance, there have been real big changes in terms of how we eat, and there have been really big changes in terms of how we move in the last several decades. And just to name a few of those, if we think about the energy in side of the equation in terms of what we've been eating and how that's changed, one of the first things that comes to my mind is just the family structure and the way that families really operate, in that basic meal times have really changed in this country. Whereas in the past, families would sit down at meals and have foods that were prepared at home. We're increasingly eating foods that are prepared outside the home. We're not sitting down together. We are eating larger portion sizes. We tend to eat larger portion sizes, foods with more sodium, more calories, when we're consuming things that are not being prepared in the home. We've also seen an increase in sugar-sweetened beverages. And interestingly, for kids, most of the sugar-sweetened beverages are consumed outside the home. They're not consumed in school. So we're talking about sugar-sweetened beverages that are being purchased in the community, purchased at home. So that's been another real significant contributor to this problem. And then there's been an exorbitant amount of marketing of different foods to kids. And we're not talking about marketing of fruits and vegetables. We're talking about marketing of high-calorie foods to children. And there are pressures that children place on families, on parents in the supermarket. Certainly parents are the ones in charge of what's purchased ultimately for the family. But kids are consumers, and they definitely play a role in influencing what's purchased in the home, as well as in stores outside the home, corner stores in neighborhoods surrounding the school before and after school time. And then when we think about the energy outside of the equation, our lives have become increasingly more sedentary. So whereas for children who used to be outside after school, playing in the neighborhood, there used to be more of a community sense where kids could play in the street, they could play in the local parks in the neighborhood, and there was going to be an element of supervision in the community outside. Kids don't have that kind of supervision anymore, so parents are concerned about safety issues in the street, safety issues in parks, so kids are increasingly indoors. And there's also been the role of television and video games and computer time, which is really increased. So there really have been factors on both the energy inside of the equation, energy outside of the equation, and because there are multiple factors that really interplay together, there are no easy solutions.
Alex?
Yeah, well, I think Jessica did a nice job talking about the energy balance. I'd like to bring up another factor also, which is it's very important, because you'll see a lot of kids having similar diets and everything. Mm-hmm. One of them is obese and the other is not. So there is the genetic factors here that are very important to bring in here. And as we continue our discussion, I'll bring up the issues that make some people more prone to obesity than others. And as we've discussed here, generally speaking, obesity is bad. It's bad for the health. And if I can have the first picture there, you see here I've outlined that it's the most common nutritional disorder in the industrial world. It's in epidemic levels in the U.S. and Europe. And what happens when we are obese? Well, it can lead to high blood pressure and related complications. You may get a stroke. So obese people are more susceptible to conditions of stroke. Obesity produces also what is known as atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is the hardening of the arteries. Hardening of the arteries, again, increases blood pressure, and you may get also heart attacks and heart failure, very bad. Beyond that, it could produce kidney failure, and very importantly also, invariably, obesity ends up in diabetes. And diabetes is really a pretty difficult condition, very difficult to deal with, and it's a condition that lives with a person their entire lives, and they have to deal with it on a daily basis. Once we get to the point where the energy balance is very much unfavorable, or the person is obese, sensitivity of the body to the hormones, especially insulin, becomes diminished, and that leads to a high sugar content in the blood and become diabetics. And we all know what happens with diabetes. You have problems of health, what they call metabolic disorders. You may get to situations where the circulation has been impeded. You can get painful extremities, diabetic neuropathy, for example. With some older people, it may require amputation because the blood doesn't get down to the extremities. So very serious situation. And this is really the big and difficult end point of obesity. So I did want to scare you a little bit, but I think it's worth keeping in mind this, because this is one thing we want to avoid. So, Dick, you may want to continue on that. And
sure. Well, let me ask a question that may be on the minds of some people who are watching this podcast. That we have here a expert on pharmaceutical responses to all kinds of biological problems. We have an expert on the school environment, and I have some expertise on the area of public policy solutions. But I think it's on a lot of people's mind when you talk about obesity. Why do you need any of our expertise? Why don't people just stop eating so much? In other words, if the problem is you're eating more than you're burning, there's more coming in than coming out. Even if there's a limit to what you can do on the output side, just stop eating. We should just tell everybody that. Why doesn't that work? I mean, I sort of jumped to the conclusion it doesn't work. I think we've been doing it. People have said, sort of wagged their finger and said, you really got to stop eating. Certainly it's true. It used to be true, at least, when in the days when obesity was very unusual, that when you had the overweight kid or overweight adult, everybody would give them the same advice, often with a wagged finger, that, you just have to stop eating. So why doesn't that do the trick, Jessica?
Well, we're surrounded by temptation. There are, I think and Alex, you'll talk more about this, I'm sure, in a little bit, but I think we're probably biologically programmed to really like to eat foods that are high in fat, high in sugar. They taste great. They are all around us. They are everywhere we go. You can't walk more than 5 feet without seeing vending machines and McDonald's and the supermarket and the corner store. And these foods are incredibly cheap. They're incredibly accessible. So, we get hungry, and it's very difficult to turn off that temptation. It takes continual self-regulation to make decisions about what to eat on a daily basis. And we're just absolutely surrounded by a context that is saying eat, 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 more, more, more.
Yeah, let me say something about the biological programming, which is that it's a very good thing we're biologically programmed that way, because if we weren't, we wouldn't be here to be having this discussion or to be concerned about obesity, because the history of the human race and actually of our predecessors in terms of evolution has been a history of food scarcity. And indeed, we even see, shockingly enough, food scarcity today, despite in the world and even to some extent in the United States, despite having probably an overproduction of food altogether. So if everyone had access to the average amount of food being produced, there would surely not be any food scarcity. But historically, that wasn't the case. So you had feast and famine situations where we were biologically programmed that when there's food around to eat it, and in fact eat the food that has the most calories in it, because that's the stuff that's really going to, you really want to store it away for the famine. So with the sweet food and the fatty food, I mean, fat has more than twice the calories gram for gram for of non-fat nutrients. So eat as much of it as you can, and that programming has served us very well until the last 25 years or so, when we hit what might be called an obesogenic environment. I know somebody said about this that the normal response of the human body to the current environment, in the United States at least, and increasingly in the rest of the world, is to become overweight or obese. That's the normal human response. We're not doing anything weird. We're not picking out. We are behaving normally, given this historically extraordinarily abnormal environment. Alex?
Well, that's true. And let me bring also another aspect. So, so people eat a lot, they become fat, they become obese. Why don't they stop eating? What's the problem? And we do see a lot of people really going through extreme efforts to lose weight. And they do lose weight, then they bring it back up again and all of that. So what's the difficulty there? Well, the word is addiction. So we know that we can be addicted to alcohol. We can be addicted to drugs like amphetamine and opioids, morphine, or even cocaine. But what about food? Well, it turns out that you can be addicted to food. And food addiction is just as difficult as the other addictions. The processing of the signal for food so goes through the brain, and it goes through the side of the brain which is the pleasure site of the brain. And that's what gets you, so to speak, hooked on it. And that makes it difficult to get out of that. And a lot of people try very hard, but they come back to these usual conditions. So how do we deal with this? There's been medications out there, and a lot of you are familiar with the fen-phen and taking drugs that increase your metabolism, put your heart rate faster. What Jessica said, get that equation in your favor. Instead of burning slower, make it burn faster. But we know now that that's difficult, and also it's dangerous. And we all know the story of fen-phen, where it was a very popular drug, and that was taken out of the market because it has problems with your heart and all of that. So how do we approach this problem if you're a pharmaceutical person? You want to make a pill that helps you to prevent obesity. So there's two sides to that story. The first side is eating less. How do we get to eat less? So there is an effort there made to produce a drug which makes you eat less. Not only does it make you eat less, but it also reduces your weight. And a drug like this has been put out in the market recently that it had to be withdrawn. But there's another side of the story there, and it doesn't have to do with the food intake. It has more to do with the way our body deals with the fats, how it deals with the lipids, about lipid metabolism. And it turns out that if you can modulate that lipid metabolism, you could produce a medication which is good, not only because you'll eat less, but also because your lipids become more controlled. You have less of the so-called bad fat, what the low density cholesterol and also the triglycerides, the brown fat, as they say, and now they know more and more about it. Turns out that our fat in the body is not all the same. There's some really bad and some not so bad. And the really bad fat is the one that accumulates around the middle of the body. No? So there are efforts in the pharmaceutical industry to develop medications that would deal with this. And at some point, I'll tell you a little bit about what was happening there. Do you want to take?
Why not now?
Okay. So you may have heard about a drug that has come out actually last year, a drug by the name of Accomplia, and if you put that slide up there, it's a French company called Sanofi, and they developed a drug which is based on the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system is a system that is related to marijuana, and it's what you would call the endogenous marijuana, these molecules that are in the body that produce the same effects as marijuana. They call them endocannabinoids. And we all know, or a lot of us know, that people who do smoke marijuana have an increased appetite. So these people, these scientists at Sanofi thought, well, what if we made a drug that does the opposite of what marijuana does? It's a CB1 antagonist, and marijuana is an agonist, means it makes you do things, and the other, it inhibits it. And they produced the first CB1 antagonist, and they found that indeed this drug blocks appetite. And they proceeded to work on this. There's been a lot of excitement about all this. There's been a big effort by other pharmaceutical companies, about half a dozen or maybe up to a dozen pharmaceutical companies, 6 of the major ones and other smaller ones working on producing these drugs. So the drug came out, and it worked very well. It could reduce food intake, but also reduce your weight. You could lose up to 20 pounds pretty well with taking one pill every day. So what was the problem? The problem is that in certain people it had side effects. And the side effects turned out to be more injurious than we thought. And because of this reason, initially the FDA did not approve it. The company had to withdraw the drug from the market. The side effects were of two kinds. They had the nausea, produced nausea, the drug, and you don't really feel well about it. And the other side effect, which was found especially with people who had depression, it accentuated the depression. And there were some incidents of attempted suicides. Small incidents, very small, and only for a certain group of the population. However, it was dangerous enough to stop the drug. So that's the fate of this drug. And since then, there's been an effort to see, can we really make a drug that has all the good things of that Accomplia and not the bad things of Accomplia? So we've been involved in this, and maybe I'll tell you a little bit about it. So let me give you a little bit of this, a little bit of gobbledygook science here, so you get to try to explain it in a simple way. So if I have the next slide. So you see now what happens there. So these drugs work on some switches in the brain. They call them receptors. And the receptor in question here is a receptor called cannabinoid receptor, or cannabinoid receptor number 1, or CB1. So this is a receptor that produces all kinds of things, including the idea of enhanced appetite. You stimulate that receptor, you get more appetite. So can we reduce the function of that receptor? Yes, we can do it. And I've shown you here on the graph, you see you could take a drug that is really very powerful and it increases your appetite enormously, and that's a full agonist. Or you could have a drug that is not as powerful and it's called a partial agonist. It increases your appetite but not as much. So if you take a drug like the Sanofi drug, this drug does the opposite. It reduces your appetite. It's called an inverse agonist. So our thought was, can we make a drug that's right in between? It doesn't reduce the function of the receptor, but it doesn't enhance the function of the receptor. It just goes in there and makes the receptor work less, because it goes in there and prevents the natural substances from going on the receptor. We call these neutral antagonists. So our quest from the very beginning was to develop these compounds, which we call neutral antagonists. So my laboratory has been involved in this now for a number of years, and we have what we think is a neutral antagonist. Okay? I want to tell you a little more about it. And if you go to the next slide, I've got some pictures there. These are the two molecules, both of them from our lab. The one on the left is AM251, and these are the different atoms that make up the molecule there. And that molecule, AM251, is an inverse agonist. It turns out the Sanofi compound is also an inverse agonist. Inverse agonist does the exact opposite. It reduces the function. So we made another compound called AM5109, and that compound is a neutral antagonist. So now was time to test these compounds. Okay, so it is a neutral antagonist. The question was, can it produce the same good effects as the Sanofi drug without the side effects? So how, first of all, do we know that it's a neutral antagonist? Well, we test it, and if you go in the next slide, you see we did a particular test, and you see that the one on the right is the inverse agonist. You see it does something there. It goes beyond the line there. It does a curve. On the other hand, the neutral antagonist doesn't do anything except it goes there and interacts with the receptor, not allowing it to do anything. So we finally got to testing this, and we wanted to see whether this neutral antagonist produced the effect, which means lowering the food intake. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see how the antagonist lowers the food effect. So our compound, which is a neutral antagonist, as you see it there, it lowers the amount of food that is taken up, and this is the one in the dark triangles, and you see that the animal here, which is a rat, eats less. Not only does it eat less, but we found that this rat loses weight. So great. But now, what happens to the side effects? Does this compound, which has different properties in the test tube, does it have also different effects as far as the side effects go? So the next slide shows you what we did to test these compounds and see whether they produce nausea. So in the first test, in the first slide that you have here, this is AM251. This is the compound we made, which resembles the one made by the Sanofi company. And you see it reduces food intake on the left, but it also, on the right, it produces nausea. And you see this is done, this is an index of nausea in rats. It's called gaping. And you see the higher the dose, the more the nausea. What about our neutral antagonist now? Let's see what happens with the neutral antagonist. So we go to the next slide, and you see here on the left, the neutral antagonist reduces food intake. You can see it here. It reduces. The higher the dose, the more you give it, the less food it takes in. And what about the nausea? No effect on the nausea. So it produces no nausea. So that was a nice breakthrough, because here we have the opportunity to produce a drug that can reduce food intake. And we later also showed that not only does it reduce food intake, but it also reduces weight. And not only does it reduce weight, but these drugs have other good things. It reduces the levels of bad cholesterol. It enhances the level of good cholesterol. And very importantly, it sensitizes the body to the action of insulin. Because one problem, as I mentioned earlier, with the obese people is that their ability to be sensitized by insulin is lost. And as a result, there is no real good measure there, and the sugar goes up. Now with this drug, sensitization to insulin is enhanced. So here it is, we have a drug which has the same properties as the good drug that came out of Sanofi, which, let's review what it does. It reduces food intake, it reduces weight, and it reduces also some of the bad cholesterol and the triglycerides, and it enhances the sensitivity of the body to insulin. And in our case, our drug does exactly the same things, but it does more. It doesn't have the side effects. We didn't test all of the side effects, but one of the side effects we tested is nausea, and we see that our drug has no nausea. It looks like it may not have the side effects of the Sanofi drug, and we're very excited about it.
Yeah, well, that is very exciting. I guess rats don't, even when they're depressed, they don't attempt suicide, so I guess you really need another stage of testing on this. What's your next step?
Well, the next step is, and we've started doing this because there are several models for testing and reproducing human conditions, human behavioral conditions in animals. So we're testing them for two things. One is anxiety, because one of the reasons these animals or humans become depressed is because of anxiety. It's an anxiogenic effect. And we have tested our compound for anxiogenesis, and it looks like it's devoid of anxiogenesis, which is very nice. This again done in rats. Now, testing for depression is a little more complicated, and it's a test that again can be done. It's not a perfect test because, as Dick said, he hasn't seen any rats that look depressed, although some people say they may be. So we are in that stage.
I've seen depressed people who look like rats, but that's different.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. So this is what it is, and we're working on that. In general, though, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about obese people, sometimes we discard this notion because we say it's their own fault. Why do they have to eat so much? Why don't they stop eating? We should consider what happens in the biochemistry of the body. And there are issues that are very difficult to deal with. One, of course, is the genetic input. Some of us, our genes are programmed to say this way that we don't burn as much, and we tend to store a lot of the fat. And the other also is the fat doesn't get metabolized the right way. And as a result, you get these fat cells, and the fat cell, which has, the size of a cell, once you get it to a person who's a fat individual, you get this huge fat cell full of bad fat. So I think we need to be sensitive to that, and also to the fact that eating food can be an addiction, and we need to exercise the different behavioral ways for dealing with addictions.
Right. Now, this is indeed, exciting as a drug, but you mentioned that in terms of the effects, even of the Sanofi drug, and I assume your compound probably would have similar positive effects, it produces up to about a 20-pound drop in weight. Now, I assume people probably wouldn't be taking this if they weren't quite overweight, and which usually means 50, 60, or more pounds. Now, my understanding is any weight you lose, at whatever weight level you are, if you're overweight or obese, any weight you lose is to the good. So you shouldn't think about this, that if I can't lose it all, then why bother? It's clearly worth bothering. But in terms of how much of the problem this will solve, my understanding is it can't solve more than a relatively small piece of the problem, that even if we have the drug without the adverse side effects, which of course will be a humongous seller. I mean, this hopefully the patent protection is all lined up and everything, because this is, if this goes, this is obviously what would be called a blockbuster drug. But even if this is on the market, if it works, no side effects, perfect, prescribed for everybody who fits this, it's going to solve maybe a third of the problem just in terms of pounds. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, but not entirely. The reason I mentioned the 20 pounds is because the Sanofi drug, Accomplia, is the one that was most tested, and it went through a number of clinical trials, so we know a lot about it. And the reason they lose only up to 20 pounds is because that is the tolerated dose. So presumably, if you were to find a drug that is safer, you could go to higher doses and presumably lose more than 20 pounds. However, I should mention there are other efforts to address the obesity issue, and they are at work. There is a drug out in the market which works in a different way. You take it and you don't absorb a lot of the fat that you eat. That's another way. It's called Xenical and so on. And there are other companies working with this. It's a problem which is a lot of attention there. However, I agree with you in general, because ultimately the solution is probably not going to be through pharmaceuticals for what one would call the obese or the morbidly obese, and you have to go to other approaches, behavioral approaches, and social approaches.
Well, I think Alex made a really good point earlier today when you said that we're all living in a similar set of environmental circumstances, yet some people tend to put on a lot of weight and develop overweight and obesity, yet others don't. And that really highlighted the interplay between biological factors and environmental factors. And I think there really needs to be a place for multiple types of a multi-pronged approach to addressing this problem. And certainly the targeting the biological underpinnings is really important, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done at the environmental level and also at the legal and policy level, as you know so much about.
Right, and I'm going to ask you in a moment about the work you're doing. I just want to sort of underline that point, which is that I wouldn't want anybody to misinterpret, Alex. I think it would be a misinterpretation to say that the problem is genetic. The problem is that some people's biology, does not process, produces fat more quickly, and the recalcitrant type than other people. That's all true, but it was all true 30 years ago, and the number of people who were overweight or obese was much, much smaller. So that while there's always a biological dimension in every case, the fact is what's different. I mean, what you look at normally in trying to figure out what is the cause of a problem, if a problem has suddenly developed or suddenly escalated way beyond, double or triple where it was just 30 years ago, you say, well, what's the cause of the change? And the biology hasn't changed. So the question is, what's the cause of the change, and what can be done about some of those causes? And Jessica, I'm sure you were just about to say the kinds of things you've been working on.
Well, the kinds of things that I've been working on have pretty much been at the school level, and there are certain things that we could do at the school level as one piece of addressing this problem. But certainly if we focus all of our efforts at the schools, we're not going to be able to make the kinds of changes that really need to be made in this problem. The school, when we talk about child obesity, and you had mentioned a tripling in the prevalence rates, the school is a natural entry point for targeting, changing the environment, and also providing education to kids, because that is a place where children spend a lot of their time for an extended period of years. So it makes a lot of sense from a public health perspective to target programming at kids at the schools. But if we, and there are a number of things that we can do in the schools, and some of those things involve curricular types of adaptations to provide knowledge to children. However, we know that the provision of knowledge by itself is not going to provide behavioral change. So we need to do other things at the environmental level and the policy level in schools as well to promote healthy eating and physical activity. Yet if we place all of our emphasis in the schools, we're just not going to be able to make the kinds of changes that need to be made. So whereas this work is important to promote healthy eating and physical activity in the school setting for children, there certainly needs to be work done outside of school hours for kids. But when we think about what can be done at schools, certainly there are curricular types of provisions that can be done. We can teach children about healthy eating and physical activity, and that can be melded into the general education curriculum. And there's been some really nice work done at the Harvard School of Public Health that's developed an excellent two curricula for third, fourth, and fifth graders called Eat Well and Keep Moving, and sixth, seventh, and eighth graders called Planet Health, where they really take the energy balance information and bring it to kids at in a way where it's combined with the general education curriculum. There are also natural points for physical activity in schools where we can encourage kids to be more physically active through structured recess programs and through phys ed times. Now those things are becoming increasingly challenging for schools because of a number of factors, but it's really hard to get this type of work into the schools, but it's really important as well. And then there are policy things that can be done at the school level. We've seen in Boston changes in what foods can be sold in schools, things surrounding fundraisers, candy sales, bake sales, thinking about the school environment and what's available and accessible to kids, and making changes at the policy level. It's really important. Getting rid of sodas from vending machines are also obvious things that have been done that have been helpful. But kids are only in school for a certain proportion of the day and a certain proportion of the year. So it's really important to pay attention to out-of-school programming, after-school programming, summertime activities, and marketing as well.
On summertime activities, I saw a study that said that kids actually put on more weight in the summer when they're out of school than they do when they're in school. Why is that?
That's actually true. There's a study that tracked kids who were in kindergarten and first grade, 5 and 6-year-olds, and looked at the trajectories of weight gain, both during school months and non-school months, and found that the trajectories were steeper during non-school months. So you think, what is it about the school day versus the summertime that can make a difference? And one of the things that's thought to contribute is the type of structure that's provided in summertime. So in the school day, there's only a certain percent of the time where kids have access to food and can eat, and there are also programmed activities for physical activity. So in the summertime, things tend to be a little bit more lax. There's less adult supervision. There's more access to lots of food, so there may be more opportunities to eat. There may be more opportunities to be sedentary if parents don't have kids in structured activities. So there's a difference in structure in the school day versus in the summertime that may contribute to that. And in adults, there tends to be more weight gain during vacations and holidays, so that kind of lends credence to the point about a structure. And when we don't have as much structure in our lives, we may be more sedentary and eat more.
Now, you mentioned there were obstacles to one thing that would seem to be obvious in the schools. Those of us, at least Alex and I probably, I certainly recall, whether you liked it or not, there was gym in school, sometimes several times a week. You'd certainly have recess. Recess would be very active. And that seems to have largely gone away while we've been, the obesity epidemic has been escalating. What's going on here, and what would it take to turn that around?
Well, I think the priority on having one of the priorities is that these things need to be funded in schools. And schools are facing incredible budget cuts right now, particularly, but they've been facing them for the past decade. And there have also been increased responsibilities for schools to have state testing, mandated testing, for things like reading and math, science, which are all important subjects, but the things that are not being tested are our physical fitness and our health. And with this increased focus on how schools are performing in these other areas, that's taken the shift away from resources that are dedicated to promoting physical education or health in the classrooms. So when principals need to make decisions about which positions need to be cut in schools, and they need to decide about a reading teacher versus a phys ed teacher, and they know that their school is going to be publishing the reading scores in the paper and on the internet, then it's pretty clear in that principal's mind what teacher needs to go.
Right. And even if the principal is just thinking about his or her own job, under No Child Left Behind, if the kids are failing the reading or math tests, they keep doing that, the principal may be out of a job. If the kids are just getting fatter and fatter and not exercising, it has nobody's measuring that. The kids are developing an unhealthy lifestyle. Overweight kids tend to become overweight adults. Even as kids, they develop these pre-diabetic syndromes and occasionally actually full-scale what used to be called adult onset diabetes, now called type 2 diabetes because pediatricians are seeing it more and more frequently. But none of this reads on the, in terms of what a school principal or a beleaguered school committee is going to be most worried about, unfortunately. So the incentive structure we have under No Child Left Behind isn't well adapted.
That's right. the incentive structure is not well adapted, but we are assessing the prevalence rates of obesity and overweight in American schools, and we're seeing this increasingly more so, where states are now mandate. Some states, starting with Arkansas, have mandated surveillance efforts, and Massachusetts is now considering this as well, to have a state-mandated surveillance of the prevalence rates of obesity in the schools. So we're seeing more and more of this.
Outside of schools, what thoughts do you have?
Well, the outside of school time can be really important in terms of providing structured physical activity opportunities for children. After school programming can provide good access for kids to be physically active. The types of snacks that are served in outside of school time can play a role. Same goes for summertime activities, having programs that are accessible to children, that are affordable to families, can play a role, but there needs to be resources available to support those types of programs in school. And we do see after-school programming in schools more and more so, and some of that time can be allocated toward physical activity promotion.
Yeah, one question is, do you think we can do anything about much of the time kids are out of school, they spend in front of the tube.
Right.
Frequently typically the television, and I know there are studies that estimate that the average kid sees something like 10,000 junk food ads a year, compared to how many ads for fruit and vegetables. Not a lot. There's a national program called the 5-a-Day program to encourage eating of 5 fruits and vegetables, and I think when last seen it was funded to the princely sum of something like $3 million or $5 million, which is, McDonald's budget for an hour of advertising probably. And, there's simply no competition. I mean, is this something where do you think we have to just throw up our hands and say that's life?
I hope not. I think we need to think about different policy approaches to regulating what kinds of advertising kids are viewing, and I'm actually curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a question as to whether it's legal it's constitutional, it violates the First Amendment rights of McDonald's, or probably even more pernicious, Coke and Pepsi, to limit them from marketing their products to kids. I mean, I think it's crazy. I mean, it's not clear what the Supreme Court would do, but I think the notion that somehow or another there's a First Amendment right to pitch a product that to children that we know, there's no question about it, we know the pitch is going to lead them, not any particular kid, you can't tell for any particular kid, but on average it's going to lead them to consuming an unhealthy amount of these foods and developing overweight and obesity. So I actually believe, my sense is, the president, I actually heard him on the campaign trail talking about this issue and saying that essentially we're not going to be able to get a handle on our Medicare and Medicaid expenses in the end unless we can do something at the prevention end. That if you just keep trying to catch up to the cure, you're not going to make it. So that you really need to do something to keep the problem from developing. It's not only kids, it's in adults. And I just, other thoughts that I think are the things I've thought about, and others, you can tax high calorie density, low nutrient density foods, and you can use the money you get to subsidize fruits and vegetables. You can ban junk food ads. You can complete the process of banning junk foods in schools. Good start with at least limiting the sodas there, but you can get rid of the rest. You can require clear calorie disclosure in packaged foods. At this point, there's so much stuff on the package that it's very hard to pull out the calories. That's the critical thing, and it needs to be typically per package rather than per serving, where for example, a 20-ounce bottle of Coke or Pepsi is 2.5 servings. I mean, do you really serve it, take one of these things and put it in your refrigerator or share it with 1.5 other friends? Not usually. You can have proportional pricing to try to unwind the supersizing war, which is really like a arms race. If McDonald's raises puts more into its burger, than Burger King and then Wendy's and so forth, you can require that if a restaurant chain has more than one size of, let's say, French fries, that the sizes have to be priced proportional to the size. That all by itself, you could have a law like that, would get rid of supersizing, and you could seriously police deceptive health and diet claims. Well, I want to thank my colleagues here. I think we are out of time, my understanding is, but I want to thank Alex and Jessica for this really very stimulating and important discussion.
Thank you.